Okay, shall we start? So welcome all of you for the second Tokyo Global Dialogue. I'm Ken Endo, professor at the Hokkaido University, Sapporo, Japan, as well as part-time professor at the European University Institute and adjunct fellow of the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Now, this second Tokyo Dialogue focuses on the Indo-Pacific of today and tomorrow, and this session on the European perspectives of this strategic transformation. Now, since yesterday in this dialogue, we have examined various issues and aspects of today's world politics. Like more fluctuated and less dependable leadership of the United States, the rise of a not so peaceful China, and the US-China rivalries, military and technological aspects, and COVID and so on. Now, given the constellation of these events and trends, what would be the potential for and the constraints upon the Japan-European cooperation? Perhaps one of the background common problematic is China. Now, as all of us know, there is a growing awareness of the Chinese challenges in Europe, and some of the countries have announced the Indo-Pacific visions and guidelines, and within this context, this session would ask the prominent speakers who I'm going to introduce moments later, the questions like, any relevance of Indo-Pacific for Europe? What sort of roles can we expect? Any importance? What sort of importance is attached on the part of Europe to this region? Commonalities and differences amongst European nations. And second, what would be the opportunities and obstacles for Euro-Japanese cooperation? And third, any concrete agenda? This sort of set of questions are going to be posed in this session. Now, in considering these sort of questions, we are very much honored to welcome 4 prominent speakers in this session. First, Madame Mogherini, Federica Mogherini, currently the rector of the College of Europe, obviously the formerly vice president of the European Commission, and the high representative of the European Union on foreign affairs. She also was the Italian foreign minister some time ago. And second speaker would be Dr. Robin Nibret. Robin is the executive director of the Chatham House, the expert of UK foreign policy as well as European Union and security policy and so on, formerly at the CSIS. The third speaker is Dr. Daniela Schwaltzer, the director at the German Council on Foreign Relations, previously at the German Marshall Fund, senior director, and the SWP. She is the expert of EU and the foreign and security policies. The last speaker is Dr. Bruno Detré, the deputy director of the Fondation de Recherche Stratégique. He's the expert of geopolitics and military policy, especially the nuclear deterrence and so on. So we have asked each of these prominent speakers to talk 7 minutes each. And afterward, we are going to have some exchanges of views before opening up to the floor. So, Madam Mogherini, are you there? Yes, I see you. So please, can you start? Thank you very much for joining us.
With pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again with that wonderful backdrop of Florence. And it's also a pleasure to see again friends and colleagues in this panel. For me, it's always a great pleasure and always very interesting to exchange on the relations that Europe has with Far East Asia and in particular Japan. First of all, because I will always keep it in my heart the moments when we signed the SPA, the EPA, and invested so strongly in the partnership between Japan and the European Union. That was a moment, I would say, of a turning point somehow, but mainly the official blessing, the official signature on a partnership and a friendship that are long-standing and very deep. I would say that's the partnership and the friendship between Europe, and I don't only mean the European Union. I say Europe with a reason, because I include the UK and countries in Europe that are not members of the European Union. With Japan, the partnership and the friendship are natural ones, I believe. We share, and we have shared so much of a common agenda. So the question whether the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular Far East Asia, is relevant or not for Europe, I think the real and spontaneous and immediate answer is for sure it is. For political reasons, for security reasons, for economic reasons, and I would say also for reasons attached to the importance that Europe gives to multilateralism and the value-based foreign policy on which Europe and Japan have always partnered. I believe that to stay in my 7 minutes, what is important and interesting to look at now is these new opportunities that come in these recent months for Europe and Japan in particular to strengthen these ties on a practical agenda, on a concrete agenda. This was, I think, last of your questions. Is there any concrete to-do list that Japan and Europe can share in this moment? And, just I think exactly 1 month ago, there was a Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels, partially virtual, in which the foreign ministers of the 27 member states exchanged with the Japanese foreign minister, not only on the strategic vision of the Indo-Pacific, which was very much supported and shared by the European foreign ministers, but also on a very concrete agenda of an action plan somehow, on what to invest together in this partnership and relationship. And I've looked at the outcome of that discussion, and I've seen a very detailed and complete list of projects and fields of action that Japan and the European Union member states share, from transport to security to climate to digital to geopolitical challenges. We share how to handle China, how to work on nuclear non-proliferation, given the importance we both attach to the issue, especially when we talk about the Korean Peninsula. How do you make sure that trade and investments are not hindered by either security elements or the impact of the pandemic? I know for sure that Japan and Europe have been working closely together to try and advance smoothly, even if it's not always smoothly, on, for instance, the vaccination campaign and on issues related to how to protect our populations, both in Japan and in Europe. From this pandemic, and also how to tackle the economic impact of this and the social impact that this economic crisis will have. So I believe that the common agenda is getting even more dense and intense in this months and years. And I think this is a good sign on which, for sure, the new US administration will also jump in. I believe that there will be, for sure, a more reliable and a more focused administration in Washington, on which also the European-Japanese relations can count more. Obviously, this will be relevant for the security aspect, And I would maybe just say a last word on this issue. I've always believed very strongly that there is one European lesson for Far East Asia that has not yet been fully explored, and that is the fact that in your region, the lack of a regional security architecture is actually, I believe, creating obstacles to further economic developments and exposing to security risks. While in Europe, we have managed over the last, I would say 70 years, if not more, to build a security architecture on a regional level, even in front of difficulties and historical heavy baggages. We've managed to build a security regional architecture that I believe has been the basis for the European economic development. So I believe that if there is one further path to be explored in partnership, would be how Europe could inspire and support efforts in Far East Asia to build some sort of security regional dialogue that would make probably life of citizens in different countries of the region, starting from Japan, more secure. Last but not least, this year we have a unique opportunity to cooperate with the UK presidency of the G7, the Italian presidency of the G20. I believe that there's a natural common agenda to be developed also at the institutional multilateral level. I'll stop here and look forward to the contributions of other speakers and the conversation with the audience. And thank you very much again for having invited me.
Oh, thank you very much indeed for keeping your presentation so short. But we come back to the various issues that you have touched upon, especially the values and so on. And you also pointed out at the end of your talk the sort of the homework that we perhaps have in this part of the region, some sort of regional security architecture. Surely we touch upon this aspect as well. Now, thank you very much. So the second speaker is Robin. Could you introduce your talk, please?
Yes, Ken, thank you very much. And pleasure to be participating in this second Tokyo Global Dialogue. Great to be with JIIA again after a little while, and very pleased to be sharing these comments with such a distinguished group of colleagues. Yeah, I note Federica Mogherini's comment about European approaches, which I very much subscribe to Indo-Pacific. Keeping that kind of broad framework obviously is incredibly important. Just to be very specific in my time, let me just set a little bit of a framework, and then also, like Federica Mogherini, maybe come to a couple of specific points as well later on. But I think in these opening remarks, it's important to share what I believe is, let's say, a European view of this strategic transformation, to take your title. The obvious first statement to make is that from a European perspective, China's rise is one of the most dramatic changes in the strategic environment that we've seen, obviously, in the last 50 to 60 years. The way that China has been able to work its way through this COVID crisis such that it is emerging as an even stronger power than it was, or accelerating its economic growth and its regional influence and even its global influence, is particularly important at this moment. It will contest the US clearly for global leadership, not just in the scale of its economy, but also in terms of its technological leadership and its impact within multilateral institutions, both of which have been areas of US hegemony and areas in which Europeans have comfortably sat alongside the United States as key partners. Now, obviously, the United States will not willingly accept this geopolitical shift. And I think the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, is going to really reach out to its allies to serve as partners in this process, and therefore create a much more realistic prospect of a joint European-American approach to China than there was in the Trump administration. But I have to say that, I do believe there are some similarities, even if there are differences, some similarities between the European and the Japanese thinking about China. The issue being that the impact of China's vast economy and growing economy has a really magnetic effect on Japan, its neighbors like South Korea and Australia, all of which have very difficult security relationships and concerns about China, but where the impact of that economy means there has to be compromise and hedging on the part of Japan. I'd say the same applies to Europe. It has been noted, I'm sure, by everyone here that in 2020, the US overtook, China overtook the US to become Europe's largest trading partner in the world. Now, that may obviously be influenced somewhat by the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, but this was going to happen at some point, and it has now been accelerated into the present. And China's threat to Europe is very different to the threat it presents to the United States, which has clear security commitments in the Asia-Pacific region. It is one that I think where the threat to the primacy of liberal values, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that aspect of wanting to contest China's projection of surveillance state approaches to governance, not just within its own country, but amongst its neighbors and into other partners. This is the space where I think Europe, along with some of the economic fears that it has about China's rise, is really going to animate European action. I stress this because it is a different approach and it's a different perspective to that brought by the United States. So the question isn't, does Europe want to contest China's rise, but how will it do so? Many people have, criticized the European Union's completion of its comprehensive agreement on investment with China, a kind of proof of European weakness. Personally, I think, in my view, I'd be interested to hear others, this may prove this agreement to be the high water mark of EU-Chinese cooperation. It kind of locks in, it does not improve particularly Chinese access to EU markets, but it does create greater clarity for European companies operating there. But now I think we'll see the EU in particular, but same for the UK, trying to diversify its relationships amongst other Asian nations, including with Japan, maybe looking into the CPTPP. And Britain, by the way, is doing the same. That golden era of Sino-UK relations is over. Hong Kong, Xinjiang, all of these issues, the exclusion of Huawei, make that very clear. Now, turning to the Indo-Pacific concept specifically, obviously I note, as this whole conference does, the fact that European nations are stepping forward to demonstrate their commitment to some type of Indo-Pacific strategy as a way of resisting Chinese expansionism in the region. We've seen the papers 2 years ago by the French government, which I'm sure Bruno will talk about, the German paper last year, a potential EU paper coming up later this year. But with all of these ideas, I do sense, and by the way, Britain, of course, as well, a little delayed, will have its integrated review on defense and security coming out probably in about a month's time, which will also talk heavily about an Indo-Pacific tilt to British foreign and security policy. But there is a real awareness that the Indo-Pacific alliance cannot match the strategic coherence of the North Atlantic alliance from a European perspective. Russia is a clear and present danger. We have an alliance commitment. We have troop commitments. We have a proper integration with the US military capabilities in this area. There is no parallel for that at the European level in the Asia-Pacific or in Indo-Pacific. And as I said, European governments don't want to isolate China the way they have isolated, to a certain extent, Russia. And European material contributions into the Indo-Pacific will be very small in comparison to those of the United States and Japan, for that matter, and India. Obviously, if you are from France, you have a certain set of sovereign commitments to that part of the world, and hence, France's clearer policy in this space. But the UK is starting to try to raise its profile. And I think its Indo-Pacific strategy will have a combination of military visits to ports, not just in that direct Indo-Pacific space, but through to Japan, through to Singapore, where the UK has its 5-power defense arrangement as well. And we will see some very clear presence by the National Cyber Force, greater cybersecurity cooperation. We have the Carrier Strike Force visit taking place later this year with US support. And I think you could see the UK and the EU being helpful also in the Indo-Pacific space in what is called lawfare, fighting over the legality of particular actions by China and contesting its illegal actions in that space. I would say, however, that there is a uncertainty in many European capitals, including the UK, about where India fits into the security strategy. And I think you'll see a much larger emphasis, and Federico Mogherini mentioned this a second ago, on the European side in how to use the G7 as a geo-economic complement to the Indo-Pacific as a more political military component. Because being able to mix not just Japan, but also South Korea, now with that invitation to them and to Australia and to India to attend the G7 meeting, that's a way of really playing up a different approach to security in the Indo-Pacific region, one that focuses on trusted supply chains for critical technology, and potentially in the future, I think as well, another very interesting area, greater coordination on infrastructure investment across the Indo-Pacific, an area that Japan in particular has put at the top of its list of priorities. If we can link some sort of the Euro-Asian connectivity strategy being developed by the EU, and actually link that in to ASEAN, India, and Japanese initiatives in that area. Again, that might be a more European approach as compared to the quite political military dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I suppose to conclude, what I wanted to contrast here is that I think for many Europeans, there's going to be a desire to engage with Japan, the US, and Australia in formats that carry more of a European flavor, in which the Europeans are more involved in designing it than the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is one that Europeans inevitably will be joining as junior partners. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Robin. I'm quite intrigued by your emphasis on the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, and India, with some European, some room for European flavor and influence. Thank you very much. We definitely come back to this point as well. Thank you very much for the comprehensive talk. Now, the next speaker is Dr. Daniela Schwaltzer. Daniela, could you please take the floor?
Thank you very much, Ken, for having me on this panel. In your introductory remarks, you also raised the question, how have the perceptions within the EU and several member states evolved? And I would like to pick it up from there, as I very broadly agree with the framework that Federica and Robin have just said. So speaking from Berlin, let me start with Germany. And here, I think the major development over the past 2 years is a far more realistic assessment of what China is to us. As Robin has mentioned, in terms of trade partner on the rise, and Germany has very often been criticized for looking not only at China, but also at the Indo-Pacific region, mainly through an economic lens, given our very strongly export-oriented growth model, but also our dependency on imports and our industry's strategic decision to spread value chains far towards the east. So that is the backdrop against which it was not easy, in my view, both for representatives of the German industry, but also for policymakers to move from a vision of China that was mainly hoping that some kind of political opening and systems transformation would eventually take place, to a very realistic assessment that China indeed is an economic partner. It is a systemic competitor, and also in very many regards a challenger to fundamental values, but also to our own sense of security by now, with its interventions within the European Union through strategic investment, but also in our neighborhood. Now, Germany has very recently added to this piece of analysis its own Indo-Pacific Guidelines. This is a first. They were published in the autumn of last year. And there are two notable things. The first one is that this is not a security or defense white book or strategy paper, but it is really a paper which encompasses a very broad set of issues and is a government's paper, not one of one ministry. So if you know the German system and how it works, this means, although it has been coordinated by the Foreign Office, there has been a lot of coordination and consensus building across government. And I think this is an important and notable step because it embraces issues of economic cooperation and partnership, of course, technology, innovation, infrastructure, but also security and defense issues, which are much more softly touched upon than, for instance, the French paper that I suppose Bruno will comment, which is really on that issue all by itself, encompasses. But what this means is that Germany has positioned itself as a key player in the European debate on the Indo-Pacific and the need to forge a strategy. The second notable issue, of course, is that China is not mentioned in these guidelines, but it is, of course, at every single point, the elephant in the room. So that's why I started with the changing perceptions of China, because the paper can only be fully understood if evaluated against this background. The German government put a very explicit commitment to, first of all, working with France into this paper, and then also its intention to bring this to a broader European conversation with the aim, and this has been mentioned by one of the previous speakers, to eventually reach a state where the EU as a whole can agree on a strategy paper towards the Indo-Pacific. This is all in the very beginning, I would say. Also, we have to take into account that we have a rather complicated electoral cycle in Europe, with Germany going to the polls this September, and the formation of a new government may last until the end of the year. And then France goes to the polls. So I think the ambition to reach a joint European strategic position on the region, to do this rather quickly, is the best choice to be made. Now, in terms of priorities for a European approach, obviously all the topics have been named, so I will just summarize not only what I think are political priorities, but also qualify them with regards to the question, where can the European Union actually make a difference? And how should we think about the UK as being a key partner? And I agree with Federica that if we look at European approaches towards the region, if it is trade, of course, it is an EU thing, but all the other issues, I would argue, take security, take climate, also take infrastructure and cooperation in terms of connectivity. I personally would advise any European policymaker to include the UK, although I, of course, know that the political situation at this point in time is not very relaxed between the two sides. Now, putting this very briefly into a transatlantic context, and Robin has said very many things on this. The Europeans are at this point under pressure to come forward with a positive, forward-leaning and very concrete agenda with the United States. And I believe it should be a priority to put China and the Indo-Pacific onto this agenda. As Robin has pointed out, our core alliance is across the Atlantic. But it is one of the biggest challenges for the transatlantic partners to actually come to a common analysis of the situation in the Indo-Pacific, but then also to devise a strategy that both sides can fully share. And if I go back to my introductory remarks, the constraints, in particular on the German side, because of our economic dependency, are very big. So any European approach, in my view, has to keep in mind the necessity to define a strategy towards the Indo-Pacific with a positive agenda and to come up with a compatible agenda with the United States vis-a-vis China, while at the same time, in order to be able to act, we need to decrease our dependency on China as Europeans and become a far more stronger and competitive player, for instance, in the areas of technology, digital transition, and also on the side of climate transition. I'll leave it here for reasons of time, but I'd be happy to come back in on some of the issues in the discussion.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Daniela. Yes, the coordinated European way of doing business is still important, inclusive of the United Kingdom as well. Yes, and at the end of your talk, you mentioned about the need to be less dependent on Chinese market. It was one of the issues that we may have to talk later on. Thank you very much indeed. Also keeping your time quite straight. Now, the final speaker is Bruno. Would you like to introduce your argument, please?
Oh, thank you very much, Ken. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of this super panel. I was asked to address the French perspective on 4 different issues: the vision of China, the Indo-Pacific, the question of the European convergence, and the question of European-Japanese cooperation. I think that the French view on China is increasingly ambiguous or ambivalent. We do see China, as many other European partners, as both a partner for climate, for Iran, for a bunch of other issues, and also a competitor increasingly on technology. And we note with satisfaction that Europe describes this increasingly as a rival, strategic rival. We do not support containment of China in Cold War terms, in the sense that, and this is a very traditional French stance on other issues, there should not be any blocks in the Cold War sense. We prefer talking about managing the rise of China, establishing a level playing field, managing also through our alliances and partnerships in the region. That being said, I think we're still pretty shy on the values part, which was addressed earlier on. I was reading this morning the readouts, the Chinese and French readouts from the Macron-Xi conversation of yesterday, and I was quite perplexed to see that there was not a single mention by President Macron of the Uyghurs question, even though 2 days ago there was actually a fairly robust statement from the French foreign ministers. So I think this omission is remarkable, quite unfortunate, I think, but also indicative of the way the French, what I call the French ambivalence or ambiguity about China. Just a word about NATO and China, increasingly a debate in Europe, as my friends and colleagues here know. I think we tend to view that it's perfectly legitimate for NATO to talk about China, to deal with China, and to be interested about what the rise of China and Chinese increasing assertiveness means for NATO. But it should be clear that it does not present a military threat to Europe, emphasize military, the way Russia does potentially. So I think we would be very cautious in not putting Russia and China on the same level, in the same box, so to say, in forthcoming NATO strategic concept. On the Indo-Pacific, just a couple of reminders. We, as a country, are both in the Indo and the Pacific. We have more than 1.5 million French persons living in the areas, and the Indo-Pacific is the reason why France claims the second largest EEZ in the world. We like to say that we're present from Djibouti to Tahiti or to Polynesia. And I just framed this because in France we say de Djibouti en Polynésie. I think it sounds better if you say de Djibouti Tahiti. We do have strong defense and security relations in the region, as well as a long forgotten commitment to the security of South Korea, as other European countries have. This audience is certainly familiar with the fact that the French are increasingly keen to, shall we say, share the flag through maritime assets and signal our attachment to freedom of navigation. A symbolic gesture from the diplomatic standpoint was that we appointed a full-fledged ambassador for the Indo-Pacific some 18 months ago. However, I don't think it would be fair to characterize the French approach as being primarily defense-driven. I think that the best catchword to describe the current French approach to the Indo-Pacific is to seek regulation for maritime safety and security, but also for environmental protection, and of course, once again, for freedom of navigation. Now, we do clearly oppose Chinese designs in the South China Sea. However, I think it's fair to say that France, the UK, and the US have slightly different ways of organizing their freedom of navigation operation. We don't do as a country. I mean, I will let Robin speak for the UK, of course, but I don't think it would be fair to say that we do freedom of navigation of operation in the sense of the US Navy. Our primary vehicle is, unsurprisingly, multilateralism, including minilateralism. I'll get back to that in a second. On the question of European convergence, I think it's fair to say that on China, convergence is a slow train coming, but still missing a couple of wagons, though, a couple of cars. The French are delighted that there is growing interest on the Indo-Pacific among several key European countries, including, of course, Germany, but also growing interest at the Commission level. And even though Europeans have, and it's only natural, slightly different perspective in terms of presence, the use of military assets, but that's okay. I think that what really matters is the increasing interest at the European level for the Indo-Pacific, even though we'll continue to have slightly different views on the best way to use our various instruments at our disposal. Like previous key speakers, I think we will want to make the UK-French cooperation an important instrument and vehicle, especially as Robin put it, that he didn't use the expression, but I believe that the post-Brexit UK will be increasingly present east of Suez, or will be back east of Suez. So I think it would be very important for us French. And another indication of the fact that our approach is not only EU-driven is that I think there's going to be soon a European intervention initiative, which is not an EU framework, dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. Let me conclude with a couple of words on Europe and Japan. I think the French priority right now is to strengthen bilateral and trilateral ties. We have in particular an important strategic trialogue with India and Australia, which are key defense partners. Of course, France, India, Australia, three very different countries, and the three sides of the triangle are actually very different. There's three different bilateral dynamics, but it's increasingly the focus of our Indo-Pacific strategy. How do we include Japan in this? Should it be a quadrilateral dialogue, another quad? I'm not sure it would make sense today. I think it makes better sense to reinforce the French-Japanese defense and security relationship. And another question, which I will leave open at this point, is whether or not it would make sense for France to join the Quad, the Quad with the big Q, the existing Quad, the US, Japanese, Australia Quad. But I think it's an interesting question to be addressed. I will stop here, Ken, if that's okay with you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. All of you have kept your presentation so short that we have really plenty of time to discuss, which is really a wonderful thing. Now, the one of the issues that we wanted to discuss today is, this sort of balance between the economic interest and the security arrangement and treatment and various systems and so on. Now, some of the speakers mentioned about the comprehensive investment agreement between Europe and China, and the Japan has concluded the the RCEP agreement at the end of last year. So, both of us have some sort of common problematic, how to balance this economic interest with the sort of nature of that regime in China. Some of the speakers mentioned about the systemic, the challenges and rivalries and so on. So I just wonder this question might be posed on any speakers of all of you, but is there anybody who has the specific view on this? I just wonder, for instance, Robin, I still remember that one of the disparate days just after the Brexit referendums and the Trump's elections in 2016, you pointed to perhaps the necessity of having a sort of free trade, trying to keep alive this free trade, inclusive of China. So I just wonder this. This general challenge of balancing this free trade economic interest with the systemic differences and so on. Anybody? Well, perhaps may I ask Robin first? Thank you.
I'm happy to. Somebody arrives at my door. My dog goes crazy, but there we go. Oh. Let me see if I can stick with this for a second. If not, I may have to go and answer the door. What I was going to say was that the UK has been on a bit of a journey. The logic of Brexit, as you might note from UK perspective, was for many of those who argued its case to be able to look beyond Europe towards, the great emerging markets around the world. And I think the UK Brexiteers always felt that somehow countries like France and Germany managed to be critical of China with one hand, but have very close economic relations with the other. And Daniela noted the very integrated nature of Germany's economic relationship. And the UK had always been rather slow on its economic drive. So the whole point of Brexit, in a way, was to be able to focus at new emerging markets, Asia-Pacific being at the top of the list, and China being very central to it. But as I noted in my remarks, the fact is that China has changed in the last 5 years. I think that is an objective statement to make. And the centralization or the intensification of the centralization of power embodied by Xi Jinping and his project, plus the tightening and much harsher repressive measures taking place in China and its actions in the South China Sea. We can go through the whole list, militarizing islands, having said they wouldn't. And obviously with it now tipping into Hong Kong has made the idea of a much closer UK-China economic relationship incredibly difficult. Now, let me just say, this is still, despite what the government has said, a very difficult position. And my position is one that's been more about analysis than recommendation. But let me give you one bit of analysis. The UK has banned Huawei now from participating in its 5G rollout with a 3-year or so time frame to be able to get them out of the system. This was done unwillingly, in the sense that Boris Johnson had hoped to be able to keep Huawei inside, because the conclusion of the British security services were that it was not a security threat. But the Trump administration obviously changed that context by preventing US chip technology to be included in those Huawei systems. And the British security services could no longer, therefore, guarantee the integrity of that technology from a security standpoint. But what's been interesting is that, of course, there's also the fear that Huawei is intimately involved in the spread of China's surveillance state. And that's a dynamic that was not on the table 3 or 4 years ago. It was not perceived as being critical to the British, or I would say broader European perspective. And that's why I emphasize this in my opening remarks. The realization that there is almost an ideological, I wouldn't say almost, I will say, an ideological nature to the contest between China and Europe, or let's say China and liberal democracies, is one that is now deeply understood or felt in the United Kingdom, as well as I would say in many EU capitals. And that change is quite fundamental, therefore, to Britain's attitude. Now, there's got some, just two quick points, difficulties. The UK is still meant to be completing a Chinese-designed nuclear power plant in Bradwell in Essex, outside London. No one's talking about that right now because the British government, I think, doesn't want to go so far as to start to point out the other areas of Chinese technology that will be excluded. So the government still has some very difficult decisions to take. But what it's trying to do, I think, is shift that kind of Brexit focus of moving to Asia to one that appreciates the limits of the relationship with China and tries to expand the potential of the relationship with Indo-Pacific. Yeah. So there's been that shift in London to de-emphasize China, recognize the conflictual nature of that without it letting it go into the Cold War space, but then play up the connections to the Indo-Pacific. And I would say, from a British perspective, the G7, in a way, is a more natural space in which to play that geo-economic role than the Indo-Pacific, which, from a UK debate standpoint, is a bit caught as being a political military project. And if it's political military, the UK has to ask itself, where does it add most value? Does it add more value to the US in filling behind the US in Europe, and maybe the Middle East, or even the Arabian, the Gulf, those areas, while the US focuses more on Indo-Pacific? Or does it actually commit heavily to the Indo-Pacific? I think the debate at the moment in the UK is, as much as we talk about now having a persistent presence east of Suez. I try to avoid the term, Bruno, yes, east of Suez for obvious reasons. Nonetheless, I think the capabilities of the UK, they might stretch to the Gulf, to the Western Indian Ocean. But once you get into that broader South China Sea area, it becomes a bit more symbolic. And the symbolism isn't unimportant, but it is more symbolic at that stage. Let me stop there.
Well, good to show the flag anyway. But anyway, yes. Daniela, have you raised your hand? Perhaps
Yes, I'd be happy to add just one aspect on the comprehensive investment agreement and the way the inner EU debate has evolved around it. First thing to observe is the negotiations have been concluded. However, this is not ratified yet, and the European Parliament has its role to play. And the point you made, Ken, this balance that needs to be struck between the normative approach and then the economic interest, I think really crystallizes there. Because the main criticism that so far has come out of the European Parliament, and that is reflected to some extent in the national debates around the EU, is the fact that the provisions for the respect for human rights, in particular workers' rights in China, from many Europeans' perspective, are not quite strong enough. And this shows you where the debate in Europe is at the moment. And I would like to add that the trade-offs that are going to be made are going to be very difficult in other regards as well. If you take the German debate, the argument mostly is that the close economic ties we build will create leverage for Europeans. For instance, on when it comes to dealing with China to move towards global more commitment to preventing climate change. So there are two sides to this argument. And the third point I wanted to make is the tech regulatory aspect in all of this. From an EU perspective, and I hope we will be including the UK in that, we are, I think, reaching a critical moment where we have to decide whether we can work with the Americans to create a regulatory space in the field of technology that is based on Western values, our norms of data protection, et cetera, et cetera. And the question here, and the 5G issue is crucial for that, not only from the perspective of security concerns, whether we are conscious enough that the standard setting that China is pushing in many ways, in particular in the region, I would say, between Asia and Europe, mainly in Central Asia and towards the eastern borders of the European Union, we may be losing ground while we speak. And so I think this balance between economic ties and creating economic leverage and protecting our own norms, not only within our own territories, but also when we reach out to other partners, is really the key issue we should be looking at.
Right, thank you very much. I think you have touched upon a very important point. That is a sort of intersection between this economic interests and the security and the normative aspects. They interact, and we just cannot just say that, oh yes, China is a trading partner, so let's pursue the economic interests while having a tough stance in the fields of security and so on. They interact, and one of the troubles could be found in the recent examples of Australia. I'm quite happy to hear the both of the British and French friends mentioned about this importance of Australia, but they have been targeted politically by China. They because of the 5Gs and perhaps the Wuhan investigations and so on. But there are many other examples. Japan is one of the early targets when the drunken captain hit the public vessels just off the coast of Senkaku Islands in 2010, and we have had 4 private persons kidnapped in China, and then rare metals was virtually de facto stopped. Now you can easily cite Czechoslovakia or Sweden or whatever. So I just wonder, to maintain the sort of free trade and the economic interests, we may have to face the reality that these two areas often overlapped. So what can we do with this sort of problematic? Should we have any sort of common mechanisms, with which to mitigate the damage targeted by the sort of singularity bullying exercise? In the European Union, are you having any debate of helping out Czechs, Swedes, or perhaps Norwegians some years ago when they were targeted their salmon exportation? I just wonder, we may have to have some sort of common treatment on this sort of example, the problematic. What's the debate or opinions are taking place? I just curious.
Ken, if the question is not addressed to any particular speaker, I'd like to say a word on 2 points that you referred to and that Daniela referred to. First of all, I'd like to emphasize very much what Daniela suggested, that the CAI, Daniela and Federica, I suppose, know these debates, follow these debates more closely than I do. With CAI is going to face a rocky road in the European Parliament. I think that the human rights issue and the Uyghur question has gained enough prominence in Europe that it's going to be one of the main barriers to its examination and adoption by the European Parliament. Coming back to the French perspective, actually, I'm quite baffled by the tendency in French governing circles, including at a very high level, to believe that the way human rights are dealt with in the CAI provides us with real leverage vis-a-vis China. And I'm afraid that even though French leaders claim to not be naive about China, they failed to go back in the history of the past 30 years and the way and to see the way China has reneged on many of its commitments in that regard, or made promises it never completely holds. So it's just to inject a little bit of skepticism and pessimism, in addition to what I said about the Macron-Xi conversation on this particular front. Second thing, very briefly, do not underestimate the amount of Chinese attempts to influence our political and cultural debates in other countries in less visible way. And there's actually a very interesting inquiry in one of the main French weeklies this week about, it's called How China Penetrates Our Universities. It's very much under the radar screen of of most people in France, really. But I think that it's the sort of things that you should expect to gain, expect these kind of issues to gain prominence in the European political debate about China.
I can add to that. I think that, first of all, Bruno is perfectly right in pointing out that, not only China, but China in particular has an impressive capacity to use a variety of methods and channels in a very strategic and long-term manner. And indeed, everything is interrelated, including culture, university, language. It's an intricate network. And I think we definitely need to have a non-naive and strategic look at that in a coordinated manner all over Europe. And that goes well beyond the European Union. And now that I'm the College of Europe, I look at that also very carefully, obviously, because I'm following the French debate. And I think that how the French authorities will react to that is going to be important also for other universities in Europe, and how to coordinate approach on that aspect. Having said that, I think that here we're touching a fundamental issue. If you allow me to zoom out a little bit, I think that the fundamental question you put, Ken, about how do we deal with the interaction and intersection, the overlap between how do we pursue legitimate trade and investments that are in the interest of our economies and citizens and businesses, with the issue of values and the fact that indeed China is a completely different and incompatible political system compared to ours. How do you balance that? And I think that the basic fundamental question goes back to, do we as Europeans, as G7, as G20, already G20, we move into a different kind of framework if we talk about political systems. How do we address the issue of legitimate trade and investments? Do we decide that we trade and invest only with countries that are liberal democracies? I don't see neither France or UK or Germany going in that direction, probably even Japan. Sorry, I can be provocative now because I don't represent anyone and don't have to respond to anyone. But I think that here, obviously China has a different size than others and has a different security impact than others. But bottom line, the basic question is this. As Daniela was saying, do we try to use the leverage of our economic power without being naive, also to push an agenda based on certain values, knowing that it's a fight, knowing that it's not to be given for granted? Or do we assume the, I believe, naive approach of not having interactions with anyone that doesn't share fully our value-based agenda, provided, sorry for the extreme provocation, provided that we all are sure that we are fully on board with that liberal democracy's agenda. Because as Daniela was pointing out, we have a complicated electoral cycle in Europe coming up. We have seen some elements that were disturbing in the United States, even recently. And we might end up, hopefully not, but we might end up having an internal debate about values and principles in Europe, in the West, in liberal democracies, And by the way, I wouldn't exclude that this is highly on the agenda, not only of Russia, but also of China. So how do we deal with that intricate link, contradictory link between the purist approach of no business with those that don't share our values, and that is a long list, a very long list. And that would potentially block global trade and investments and probably open the space for others to benefit from our absence, by the way. Or on the other side, how do you make the most out of an economic engagement, as Daniela was mentioning, that give us some leverage, provided we are coordinated, which is not always the case, provided we invest in common multilateral effective frameworks, starting from the multilateral organizations, and provided that we are not naive on the limits of this approach, knowing and looking at the repercussions of some of the economic investments and some of the trade agreements that might have dangerous implications for us and for our security. Not military, I agree, but security impact can be relevant. And look at how to contain, mitigate, and prevent this kind of impact. So I think this might and would require a strategic, long-term, coordinated approach, not only among Europeans, but probably among a larger group of countries. Again, the G7 could be the right place to address this discussion, but I will never forget during one of the G7 ministerial meetings I attended during the 5 years, 6 actually, of my mandate as Italy. It's also part of the G7. I've taken part to that in different roles, but at a certain moment, someone raised the point of going back to the format of G8, and some were assuming that the 8 would have been Russia, and some others would have assumed that it would have been China. Just to say that maybe we have to start from a common understanding at home of what sense of strategic direction we give to our own economic, foreign/security policy. And the three are interlinked.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful debate. If I may I shift to the Indo-Pacific side, if I may, because this is the conference overall concern. Now, it's been already 5 years that the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Abe, announced this strategy or vision now. Robin said that instead of this forum or region, the Quad would be better suited to pursue the common interests. And also we may have to talk about well, this is about the concept of the region, but also the method or methodology to pursue the common interests. Now, I think there are two separate questions. Now, what would be the sort of residual importance attached to this region of Indo-Pacific? Now, the Bruno rightly referred to the French aspiration that French was and is the Indo-Pacific power. Now, so it's a welcome concept, perhaps, but how should we gauge the importance attached to this region by the Europeans? I know that the Robin is skeptical and the Quad is bad, but are these two contradictory? By the way, as the former Prime Minister Abe first referred to the Quad in the first term of his premiership, and then shift to the Indo-Pacific. But these two are not so contradictory in the Japanese terms, perhaps. So I just wonder what sort of conceptions and importance contained in this region. And then second, how to promote the common interests, in this wider, bigger regions, or focusing on Quad, if you want. The UK has this, will dispatch the Queen Elizabeth II. France has had submarine operations in these days. I think Germany may have some, snags in doing the same, perhaps, but they are somewhat joining. Now, what sort of method do you expect to employ? And finally, sorry, related to this, the EU has had the strategic papers under the Madame Mogherini's leadership, and but it's widely reported that the EU is considering the common Indo-Pacific some sort of guideline, following the French and German and Dutch examples. I just wonder what sort of things would it be? So, any of you, who should start? Robin, would you like, please?
I'm happy to jump in as others have just been speaking, and hopefully I'll buy them some time to say something more cogent maybe than I will. A very big question just asked there, Ken. Just a few thoughts. I just want to stress what I said earlier, that to my mind, the term Indo-Pacific is so broad that it borders on being meaningless. I know that's a heretical thing to say these days because everyone's got strategies for it, but I think the strategies for it are partly responses to the US and a desire to show that we're leaning forward, that we appreciate the risks, the growing risks emanating from China, that we want to show that we will be good allies to our liberal democratic partners in the Asia Pacific. We want to show to the United States, especially a Biden administration, that we will be shoulder to shoulder with them on their top security concern, like the United States is shoulder to shoulder with us on our top security concern in Europe and around Europe. So there is a certain symbolism to it, which doesn't make it unimportant. But I just want to state the obvious: the Indo-Pacific is so big as a concept, it's really hard to organize practically around it. And I would just stress that point again. Where does it start and where does it end? And what do different countries bring to different parts of the Indo-Pacific? I like the Djibouti to Tahiti concept. And for the UK, the Western Indian Ocean becomes very important. But then, as I said, we have, from a UK standpoint, commitments to Malaysia and Singapore in the five-power defense arrangement, as well as to Australia and New Zealand. We all bring a different angle to it. Let me also add, there is a debate going on in the UK that if you start to use Indo-Pacific consistently, then what you are doing is starting to create the intellectual framework for a Cold War II. Because there's a British debate going on right now saying that accepting the concept of Indo-Pacific is to accept a realignment of global affairs, as took place in 1945, with a new line of confrontation that implicitly becomes the first or second island chain around China. And there are many in Britain who subscribe to that. I say many, at least in those debating this strategically and saying that it's time for Brexit Britain to line up with the United States and with those new allies that we left the EU to have a better relationship with, and recognize this is the new global alignment, yes, where implicitly you do need to contain China. So the term Indo-Pacific in London is becoming freighted, to use that term, loaded with a new strategic alignment that some people resist and other people advocate. And my last, I suppose, problem slightly with Indo-Pacific, which is where I was earlier, is what's the structure? The term a free and open Indo-Pacific doesn't give you a structure. It's a concept. The Quad, however, is a structure. And I come back now to my point. What does this mean in a practical sense? If you're in London or Paris, you have no choice but to take what is happening in the broad Indo-Pacific region seriously, because both countries are permanent members of the UN Security Council. Irrespective of the treaty commitments we may have, irrespective of the sovereign interest that France has in the region, we as two countries have to take it seriously, because at some point it may emerge into a Security Council issue. And I raise that because, having been on a few Indo-Pacific calls in the last few weeks, I'm reminded that the temperature, the security temperature in the eastern part of the Indo-Pacific, in the East China Sea, and you mentioned this, Kendo, is rising. Threats around Taiwan, who can project where we will be in 5 or 10 years' time? Where are France and Britain if something really serious were to happen around Taiwan? Would we step back and say, no, we would have no choice? As permanent members of the Security Council, we would have to be engaged, even if we weren't engaged as US or NATO allies. So I think there's a realization growing in capitals around the world that you have to do contingency planning and real security thinking about that region. I'm conscious around the Senkaku Islands, I think literally in the last 2 to 3 months, a huge increase in Chinese maritime interventions around the Senkaku Diaoyu Tai, as they call it in China Islands. And they are deliberately testing, and there's been new raising of the military capabilities of some of the coastal forces that the Chinese have. Are we fully aware of this in Europe? I don't think we are. We've tried not to look at it. And most commentary around Indo-Pacific Alliance is avoiding almost those really hard takes on the security risk there. But in terms of what we can do, apart from recognizing this risk, I suppose what I'm leaning towards saying is, at a geoeconomic level, let's invest more in a broader concept of the G7 or a G+ around supply chains, strengthening the West first before you start thinking about how you take on China. That's number one. Number two, then think about structures that are practical. Quad plus E3 or E3 plus. What is the E3 these days? Should it be Italy, France, and Germany with plus the UK? I'm sure Federica Mogherini might have some views on this, but whatever we call that E group, with the Quad, those EU members or European countries that have a stake and a commitment to the Indo-Pacific region, but have it differently to the Quad, teaming up with the Quad countries to say, we take this seriously, with the G7 maybe as an umbrella behind it, but as a bit more security and economic. So we as Europeans invite Australia, South Korea, India into the G7. The Quad maybe invites the E3 over to the Quad. We need to sort of knit together in a real way. I'm just very worried that lots of strategy papers about the Indo-Pacific are going to be completely meaningless. It'll make us feel we've said something good, but they're just going to be words. And China is not about words. China is about action today. So we need to think about what is our action. And I don't minimize the port visits, the exercises, focus on interoperability of our defense systems, cyber cooperation, intelligence. This is all important stuff behind the scenes. But China is going to be looking as well at how united the liberal democracies are. And I think Indo-Pacific strategies are paper tigers, whereas cooperation between Quad, E3, this is more meaningful, I think, maybe. In any case, that's my provocation back to everyone else.
Clear and interesting. Quad plus, perhaps, and then great to have your intervention. Please, Bruno, have you raised your hand, please?
Yes, two additional, not provocative, but at least two additional suggestions. First of all, to what Robin just said, I think the logic of avoiding an anti-China bloc, a Western liberal anti-China bloc, is also in deterrence terms an advantage. These are issues that have been studied over and over, but there is some merit in having a fairly unpredictable network of like-minded countries which talk to each other, which are interoperable, which can act together in terms of crisis, but we do not necessarily have the same unified position on each and every East Asia security issue, because it makes things more complicated for China, to make it simple. There is some merit, again, some deterrence merit in not having a bloc. It may sound counterintuitive, but that's something that the UK, France, and the US have been discussing for ages in a NATO-European security context. Second point, Robin, you just gave me a great idea that I think the four of us, the four European participants in this panel, should really explore. Even though there is more interest and consciousness about the importance of Asian security issues in Europe, and this has been growing literally for the past 25 years, we really do not have enough pall-mall exercises, crisis management, brainstorming sessions on how we would react in such Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific contingency. This is something that our leaders occasionally tackle, but very briefly. And I think think tanks and universities should have a project. I mean, it's literally a good idea for a concrete project, bringing together experts and in the back seats only, officials, because I think it's more difficult for officials, thinking about our reactions in given, trying to think about possible reactions, economic, political, military, in a given East Asia contingency or Indo-Pacific East Asia contingency. So, Robin, Daniela, perhaps Federica, if the college is also interested, the think tankers, we should really think about that. Sorry for being too long. I keep my second comment very brief. I was really interested to hear Robin about this alleged pushback in the UK about the use of the word Indo-Pacific, because we just had a mini pushback last year, 2 years ago in France also. And this is a misunderstanding. The idea that the Indo-Pacific is a US construct is, of course, not true. And Japan knows that very well, because Japan was one of the two countries which promoted initially the concept of the Indo-Pacific. On the French side, I can tell you from first-hand experience that we became convinced of the relevance of the Indo-Pacific as a concept by an in-depth strategic dialogue with our Australian partners, which started literally 10 years ago. So when we had the same kind of pushback, we're adopting an American concept, we're aligning ourselves with the Americans to contain China, I was literally shocked and surprised, because that's not what's in store. I mean, that's not the idea. But it's very interesting that France and the UK have similar experiences in that regard. Macron's mistake was to call it an Indo-Pacific axis. Oh, no, sir. This is not a word that you should use. Not a word that you should use. Fortunately, he does not use it anymore. But to conclude, I will say that one of the best intellectual defenses against these criticisms is, I really think that the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Free and open is not containment. It's a positive agenda. So that's the reason why I've always liked this expression.
Quite interesting. Thank you very much indeed. I just wondered if there are any reactions from two ladies to the extent that this Indo-Pacific vision is too masculine, perhaps, to comment on. Just is there any?
Well, I just want to react to what Robin said. Concepts are nice, but if we don't put action behind this, they don't lead us to anything. And here I want to pick up what Bruno said. I totally share his view that we are not fully prepared for an escalation of the situation in the Indo-Pacific. And I was glad, Bruno, that you mentioned not only security concerns, but also with regards to economic and other dimensions where China could play out its strength. And I observed this in Germany, where the guidelines clearly are a step forward. But I would fully subscribe. We don't know what we would do, and we would probably take too long. and we would be too hesitant and hence lose credibility. And that would undermine the concepts themselves. So I do think either we as think tankers or policy advisors should do this exercise. And I frankly don't think we are there yet. And it would be interesting, of course, to do this among Europeans, but at some step of the process, of course, players from the region should be involved, because what we need is an even more realistic understanding, although I think, yes, there's more interest in the security situation in the Indo-Pacific region now, but this is by far not fully understood and not on the top of the agenda. And so we really need to, think tanks need to do a job here, but also our governments, frankly, need to engage more.
Not much to add. I have to say, I'm not an academic and I'm not a think tanker, so probably I can bring a different kind of view. Words and concepts are important for sure, but at the end of the day, policies and agendas tend to be slightly more relevant in daily work, and especially in these times of renewed and revitalized power politics we're living in this last few years. Indeed, I think all over Europe, it's not just a UK or French reaction that was there. At a certain moment, there was the perception in Europe, not only when the US started to use the concept that indeed was used already in the region, but already before, during the last years of the Obama administration, with the pivot to Asia, there was a sense in Europe that we had to somehow realign and follow the change of priorities, of geopolitical priorities that was happening in Washington, or counterbalance it or contain it. I think that now we've gone a bit different way, but to me, somehow the main point is this. To try and avoid that the positive agenda is completely hijacked by the thinking about contingency and containment, which has to be there. But I personally feel at the end of this conversation a little bit the risk that what we have in terms of bilateral or multilateral relations or regional relations with those partners and allies in the region, there are partners and allies, no doubt, and with whom obviously we need to build also a common view, or at least a coordinated view, which is not the same, Bruno. Having a coordinated strategy doesn't necessarily mean having a common strategy. You can articulate different positions, knowing who is doing what, with a division of labor, with a division of, but a coordinated strategic common approach. Obviously, we need to talk about how we handle China, and I use handle in having thought of the word, how we also have some coordinated strategy towards, for instance, regions that are in between. I think of Central Asia. I think of Southeast Asia. I think of the Pacific proper. There is or the African side of the Indo-Pacific, which is for Europeans not irrelevant at all. There are a variety of connections to this. To me, what is really important, maybe it's my political background, is that we managed to create a coordinated, shared, not only vision, but also agenda with positive actions with those partners that are there around the region and in the region, in different continents. It actually involves, I would say, all the five continents, because when we talk about Indo-Pacific, there's also the Pacific side of Latin America, for instance. I mean, the complexity of this is indeed global. And I think that Europe, not only the European Union, is well positioned to try to build a positive agenda based on the network of partnerships on different topics, being it trade, investments, digital, security, maritime, energy, transport, whatever, without only focusing on how to countermeasure the threats we're facing, because this is important, but we risk to focus only on the containment and to forget to promote our positive agenda that we have. And I believe would be the biggest gift to those that would like to slow it down and have more attention only on their own positive agenda. That it might be important, and it is important for us to study and handle and manage. But I think that we should not forget that we do have our own proper positive agenda to nourish, and that exists regardless of China, Russia, you name it. And I think that in this, if I can conclude on this point, the relations between Europe and Japan, as well as relations between Europe and others in the region, are strategically important and shouldn't be underestimated or looked only through the lenses of what do we do on China. In my experience, I'll close on that. I found out, especially as the High Representative of the Union, that sometimes we normally, this is natural, this is human, we tend to focus a lot of attention and resources on countering the threats or preventing the risks, and we forget or we pay less attention, we dedicate less resources to nourishing friends and partners that with a little investment bring us a lot. And it takes a lot of energy and resources and sometimes conflictuality to handle difficulties and threats, and this needs to be done, but not at the detriment of investing positively on the positive agenda we have with the so many partners around the world, starting from Japan.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. It's legitimate concern and the need to have a positive agenda to create the sort of a stable and peaceful region. That is really an important topic. It's almost the end of the session, but I think I need to pick up one of the questions posed from the floor. Sorry for this not so positive agenda, but anyway, let me read out this. Does the panel see a chance of European cooperation on the growing movement to oppose the hostage diplomacy? Is this not likely to become a test of the Europe that protects rhetoric? This is the question posed from the floor. I guess this is referring to the Canadian-led sort of initiative. And then I just mentioned about the 2010 incidents as far as Japan is concerned. In fact, one of my university colleagues was sort of detained 1.5 years ago, university researcher. But anyway, so is there anybody who wants to answer this question from the floor?
Ken, just a quick comment to Philip's question. As I said earlier, it's so important that we find frameworks to make sure that we are better coordinated amongst the liberal democracies in general, whether it's against provocative or even illegal steps taken by Russia or China or anyone. And, this isn't a China-specific issue, or Iran for that matter, because obviously the UK has a whole bunch of hostage taking that's gone there. Again, it's only meaningful if everyone is then willing to take common steps in response. And we've seen that because of the presence and proximity of and the blatant nature of some of the steps taken by Russia, that you've had very direct steps taken in response, which are sanctions, targeted sanctions, but sanctions. So the question is, can you create a sufficiently coordinated position across both European countries, but also with countries in the region? Because obviously you're talking about Canadian hostages here, and we talk about Japanese hostages, which are by definition not European. Would you agree to extend that protection beyond Europe? Or if the question is applying only if one of the, let's say a European hostage situation were to emerge, diplomatic hostage were to emerge, I would hope that the European reaction would be unanimous. But I almost leave it maybe to my other EU colleagues to talk about what it was like when economic hostage diplomacy was undertaken vis-a-vis Norway, specifically, a non-EU member, but a member of the European Economic Area nonetheless, after the award of the Liu Xiaobo Nobel Peace Prize. I think maybe this discussion about Indo-Pacific, although it's a cipher, it's almost a vehicle for it, maybe starts to force European governments to think more coherently about their position. I think I'll finish with this comment. It's interesting to see how the UK government is dealing with the Xinjiang question, and it's high profile right now in the UK. Rather than looking to sanction specific Chinese officials or actors, which may end up having very little practical effect beyond this demonstration, what they're doing is looking to punish European companies that are involved in the supply chains that use inputs that are labor inputs that are taken through forcible means, as are suspected to be taking place in Xinjiang with illegal Uyghur labor. And I think just having these conversations about how we do our responses in ways that we can control and that don't, as Federica Mogherini said, then create a new line in the sand that we can't sustain is going to be incredibly important. I would hope that if something like that were to take place against, say, British or Italian or French or German or any other citizen, that the reaction would be swift and coordinated. And again, I think the G7 framework is probably a very good one in which to undertake this. But yes, we need to be ready for these contingency plans today, as I was saying, as Bruno said, and I think as Ken has, and as the question from Philip Shetler-Jones indicates.
I can add on this point. I imagine that the approach I experienced from 2014 to 2019 and the High Representative has not changed in this last couple of years. The European Union, and in particular the High Representative, but all the top leaders of the Union, constantly includes also non-EU and non-European citizens in any démarche, any reach out, at all meetings they have, not only with the Chinese authorities, but also other authorities around the world that are involved in this kind of practices. So this has always been consolidated, or at least since 2014 for sure, consolidated EU practice, namely with citizens, again, with citizens that are for sure connected with our G7 environment and beyond. That has always been the case. I have personally faced some of the individual cases, again, not only with Chinese authorities, but also with other authorities around the world. I will not enter into details here, but this is, I would say, one of the few things on which the European Union plays a similar to consular role, also on behalf of other countries around the world. As you know, the European Union doesn't have any consular competence. It is acquiring them, I believe, with the COVID situation, because it covers areas where not all member states have embassies and consulates. So it's offering support also to citizens of the Union in a consular-related manner. But this aspect in particular has always been integral part of the reach outs, and also the work on the ground of the delegations of the European Union constantly, in a more vocal and in a less vocal manner, but on a daily basis, I would say. And I trust this will continue.
Great, thank you very much indeed. The conference organizers have said that it's around the time to wrap out, and then just 3 minutes after the scheduled time. I think it's not for me perhaps to summarize the rich argument taking place here. I just would like to thank you very much for the high quality, the arguments and debates by the prominent speakers here. From the very early morning in Europe, and thank you very much for this. I can't show enough applause, from the audience, but I'm sure that they have enjoyed this debate. So let me say thanks again, and let's have continued dialogue. Perhaps the the Tokyo Dialogue third, the next year. But anyway, thank you very much. Let's stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Ken.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Good to see you, colleagues.
Ciao, grazie, merci, ciao.
Ciao.